The Subcommittee on Research and Technology will come to order. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Improving Technology Transfer at Universities, Research Institutes, and National Laboratories. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biographies, and truth and testimony disclosures for today's witnesses. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Today's hearing is being held to review innovative approaches to technology transfer at universities, research institutes, and national laboratories, and to examine a discussion draft of legislation titled the Innovative Approaches to Technology Transfer Act of 2013. In 2012, the federal government funded more than $131 billion in research and development activities. More than half of all basic research conducted at our nation's colleges and universities is funded by the federal government. According to the Association of University Technology Managers, technology transfer is the process by which universities and research institutes transfer scientific findings from one organization to another for the purpose of further development or commercialization. The Bayh-Dole Act, passed in 1980, changed the incentive structure for universities and research institutes to work with commercial entities, including small businesses, to license and patent technologies. The Small Business Technology Transfer, or STTR, program was created to provide federal R&D funding for proposals that are developed and executed jointly between small business and a researcher in a nonprofit research organization. My own state of Indiana has seen 99 STTR awards totaling more than $26 million. Both Bayh-Dole and the STTR program have helped to create jobs and translate new technologies into the marketplace. However, while the rate of technology transfer at our nation's universities, research institutes, and national laboratories has increased since the passage of the Bayh-Dole Act and the creation of the STTR program, I believe we can do even better. The draft legislation, I'll get that right, which is being developed under the leadership of my colleague from New York, Mr. Collins, will create a program to incentivize research institutions to implement innovative approaches to technology transfer to achieve better outcomes. The legislation would dedicate a portion of the STTR program funding to provide grants to research institutions to help facilitate and accelerate the transfer of federally funded research and technology into the marketplace. We will be hearing today from the co-founder of a growing biotechnology business based in Charlottesville, Virginia, that was developed out of federally funded R&D with the assistance of private foundation technology transfer grant funding. We will also hear from the Assistant Vice President for Research and Associate Director of the Burton D. Morgan Center for Entrepreneurship at Purdue University in my home state of Indiana, and from the Assistant Vice Chancellor of the Office of Innovation, Technology, and Alliances at the University of California at San Francisco. Our witnesses have firsthand experience in technology transfer and can provide insight into how the proposed grant program could help facilitate better technology transfer outcomes. I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses on their thoughts about the proposed legislation, including any recommendations they have for improvements. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for being here today, and we look forward to your testimony. I'll now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipinski, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for being here to share your thoughts on this topic and the draft legislation we are considering today. Today, concerned Americans continue to ask the question, what's the future of American jobs? A big part of our future competitiveness depends on our ability to move new and emerging technologies out of the lab and into the mainstream of commerce. Accelerating technology transfer from our universities and national labs has been one of my highest priorities since I've come to Congress. I believe the potential for job creation emanating from research being performed at these institutions is immense. We must capitalize on these opportunities and get the best possible return in our investments in research through the creation of new products, new companies, and new American jobs. Let me make one point clear. Our competitors have noticed how well our innovation system works, and many are trying to imitate it. Countries like China and members of the European Union are now investing heavily in their own R&D programs. Combined business and government spending on R&D in China, for instance, has been increasing by almost 20% a year over the past decade. and China has already overtaken Japan as the #2 publisher of scientific articles. They're determined to move up the value chain into higher tech, higher paying jobs. We need sustained investments and smart policies if we want to remain the world leader in science and technology. However, the path from the lab to a successful business is anything but straightforward. It depends on an integrated network of private companies, scientists and engineers, universities, venture capitalists, startups, and entrepreneurs. It also depends on the entrepreneurial environment, timing, and luck. Some universities have had more success in technology transfer than others. Some scientists are better prepared or more inclined to be entrepreneurial. In some parts of the country have cultivated networks of entrepreneurs and venture capitalists who have vast experience turning ideas into products that can transform our everyday lives. The draft legislation attempts to increase the successful transition to thriving startup by supporting innovative approaches to technology transfer. The draft bill language is similar to an amendment I sponsored 2 years ago to the Creating Jobs Through Small Business Innovation Act of 2011. My amendment was incorporated into SBIR STTR reauthorization with bipartisan support and allowed for a proof of concept pilot program at the National Institutes of Health. That amendment, similar to the legislation being discussed today, did not spend any new money. Instead, it allowed NIH to use money from their STTR fund to set up a grant program to support translational research and entrepreneurial education activities at universities across the nation. At a time when we struggle with job creation in a fast-changing global economy, we need to be looking more closely at how best we can help our universities and national labs, filled with the world's best researchers, be even better economic engines that power America's future. When technologies have been developed with federal taxpayer resources, we should explore whether there is a role for the government to play in aiding potential commercialization. Most venture capitalists are unwilling to take on the risk in their early stages of the innovation ecosystem, and in fact, their investments are moving farther and farther downstream. I believe this legislation has the potential to improve our return on investment in research, and I'm interested in our witnesses' recommendations on the draft bill. In particular, I'm interested in hearing their comments on using funds from the STTR program to support technology transfer activities, as well as their thoughts on the reporting obligations in the draft bill and whether this information is readily available or would be overly burdensome to collect. I know that alleviating bureaucratic burdens on universities has rightfully been the focus of the subcommittee. I also hope the witnesses will provide us with some information on best practices, model programs, or policies that can improve the technology transfer process, an appropriate role of the federal government in supporting such efforts. The draft legislation as written gives agencies discretion on what types of programs to fund with these grants. I'd like to understand the most useful places for the federal government to be involved and the major gaps or barriers federal resources can help overcome. I look forward to working to advance legislation on this important topic. We need to do all we can to help turn American discoveries into American jobs. And as I said, I very much like this, the draft legislation we have out there, maybe because I believe Mr. Collins is a mechanical engineer, the most brilliant people that there are. But I think that there's a lot that we can learn from the witnesses today about how best to take the draft legislation and put it into a final bill. But I appreciate the opportunity to hear from our witnesses today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Johnson, for a opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for calling a hearing today on this draft legislation, Innovative Approaches to Technology Transfer Act of 2013. I'm glad that this subcommittee has taken a serious look at the issue of facilitating the creation of successful, profitable, and sustainable small businesses from the discoveries of our research and development enterprise. The topic today is so critical to our nation's economic and national security. As we continue our efforts to keep our economy on the path of recovery, it is more important than ever that we recommit ourselves to innovation in the United States. As the President remarked 2 years ago in his State of the Union address, we need to out-innovate, out-educate, and out-build the rest of the world. Our universities and federal labs are the foundation that America's future will be built upon. We have world-class scientists and engineers engaged in cutting-edge research that can change the world. We must examine how to translate and transition this research out of the lab into the marketplace. Our innovation model has been the gold standard for many years, and nations around the world have been adopting it. However, we are all very aware that our competitors are multiplying their investments in not only R&D and STEM education, but also in commercialization activities. The United States cannot afford to be left behind. The ideas from our researchers and entrepreneurs with the most commercial potential deserve our best efforts. In contemplating the next steps for advancing technology transfer, our ultimate goal is to promote the creation of innovation ecosystems that sustain long-term and mutually beneficial collaborations. Many of today's most beneficial technologies did not emerge out of a straight-line process, but rather they involve the interactions of a network of various public and private sector elements. While we understand that university culture and business culture are separate and unique entities, we need to learn more about innovative approaches and collaborations that can accelerate technology transfer of federally funded research. I believe there is not a clear and distinct line in the innovation process at which the public role ends and the private role begins. The next development or discovery is built on a shifting platform where the lines between research, development, and a final product in the marketplace are blurred. The feedback is critical and cannot continue without consistent support for the people and the institutions that make up the innovation ecosystems. The federal government has a great stake in the nation getting a return on the investments we make, and we need to know what we can do that would be helpful to the academic community and startups in improving technology transfer. The draft legislation we are considering this afternoon has the potential to improve technology transfer, and I hope that the final version can reflect good ideas from both sides of the aisle. I'd like to add my thanks to the witnesses for being here today and for providing us with their recommendations on how to make this bill better. I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues to move legislation that addresses this important issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. This time I'm going to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Brian Wamhoff, Vice President of Research and Development and co-founder of Hemashire LLC. Dr. Wamhoff has expertise in small and large animal models of vascular disease, molecular biology, cell-based systems, toxicology, and interventional vascular device development. Dr. Wamhoff obtained a BS in biology with a minor in business administration from Rhodes College and received his PhD in medical physiology from the University of Missouri in 2001. Our second witness is Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, Assistant Vice President for Research and Associate Director of the Burton D. Morgan Center for Entrepreneurship at Purdue University. Dr. Hartwell is responsible for managing the commercialization of Purdue's intellectual property assets, which includes responsibility of evaluating innovations, developing commercialization strategies, memorializing commercialization agreements, promoting discovery with delivery, forming startup companies, and overseeing compliance with federal technology regulations. I don't know how she has time to do all that, but she does. She earned a doctorate in chemistry from Rice University, where she was a Turner Outstanding Graduate Student in Organic Chemistry and a Harry B. Weiser Research Scholar and Robert A. Welch Foundation Fellow. She earned a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Indiana University. She is a member of the American Chemical Society, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the U.S. Patent Bar. Our third witness is Dr. Eric Liam, Assistant Vice Chancellor, Office of Innovation, Technology, and Alliances at the University of California at San Francisco. He has held prior positions at UCSF of Vice Chancellor of Research, Director of the Industry Contracts Division, and Interim Director of the Contracts and Grants Division of the Office of Sponsor Research, and Director of Business Development for the Diabetes Center and Immune Tolerance Network. He served as a postdoctoral research scientist at UCSF, earned a PhD from the Integrated Program in Cellular, Molecular, and Biophysical Studies at Columbia University, and a BS in Biology from Gonzaga. Thanks again to our witnesses for being here this afternoon. As the witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes, after which the members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. I now recognize Dr. Wamhoff for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Thank you. Dear Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of this very important committee, as an entrepreneur and scientific executive of a startup company, I can state categorically that the American economy and its 300+ million consumers of healthcare products and services have benefited profoundly from federal programs that fund early-stage research in the medical sciences, particularly the SBIR mechanism. Thank you. I've been invited to address 3 questions. I want to tell you a story first. By way of background, I was an associate professor at the University of Virginia's Department of Medicine in the cardiovascular division from 2006 until 2012. Through a collaboration with Dr. Brett Blackman, who Mr. Collins is also a mechanical engineer, in the Department of Biomedical Engineering, we developed a technology at the university that became the foundation of a very successful biotechnology research company, HemoShear. We co-founded the company in 2008. I now serve as Vice President of Research and Development, and Brett serves as Chief Scientific Officer. We are literally changing the decades-old global drug discovery and development paradigm. The old methods are inefficient, time-consuming, and more than 92% of drugs that go into humans today fail. They either fail because they don't work, or they fail because they're not safe. We see it every week in the news. The adverse financial impact of these failures, in combination with patent expirations, has driven consolidation of the industry in the recent years. Our technology, which is developed out of the University of Virginia through mechanisms that we're talking about today, has enabled the industry to transform its drug discovery paradigm while significantly improving its return on investment capital. This is because HemoShear can measure and predict the response of a drug before it ever enters the human body. HemoShear is a successful American company. We're creating high-value, STEM-related jobs right here in Central Virginia, while positioning itself to become a world leader in drug development. The SBIR mechanism has been critical in this process. So how has proof of concept funding been used to launch HemoShear? The development of the technology at the University of Virginia was funded by 2 seed grants, rather than the traditional NIH funding mechanism that my lab and Brett's lab was being driven by. The 2 funding mechanisms were the University of Virginia Hartwell Partners Fund and the University of Virginia Wallace H. Coulter Foundation Rope Fund. Without these seed funding mechanisms, it is doubtful that HemoShear would exist as it does today, and very doubtful that I'd be sitting here right now. Equally important to funding the critical R&D to launch this technology was the exposure that we were given to very successful board members from both organizations. The endless advice, hands-on help towards translating an academic technology to a business model for commercialization, going from academia to a commercial endeavor. It's a huge gap. It is important to note that at the time, this was not common at the University of Virginia. And by example of that success, this mechanism has become a core of the university's technology transfer ecosystem and philosophy. Now at HemoShear, we've also been privileged to secure funding through the NIH Small Business Innovation Research Program, the SBIR mechanism. It has been instrumental in the technological growth of HemoShear, allowing us to further advance our technologies for drug development in cardiovascular disease, diabetes, liver toxicity, and cancer. We have proven that the SBIR mechanism provides a great return on investment for the U.S. taxpayer. Thank you for continuing supporting that program. What are my thoughts on today's issue? I feel that it would be beneficial to dedicate a portion of the STTR program to proof of concept and other technology transfer programs at universities, research institutions, and national laboratories. Having run a large NIH-funded academic laboratory and co-founded a rapidly growing biotechnology company, I've lived in both worlds. It is very challenging, and the investigator often finds himself, herself, in conflict. The old adage that it's hard to have two bosses couldn't be any more real in that scenario, and often your bosses are diametrically opposed. Bosses from the commercial side and bosses from the academic side. As I stated in question 1, if it were not for the exposure to the board members of the Hart Board and the Coulter Foundation, it is highly unlikely that we would have had the foresight or wherewithal to commercialize a very important technology for human health. The failure to commercialize academic research is not for the lack of entrepreneurial faculty wanting to do so. There are many. Rather, it is due in part to the lack of institutional support to assist faculty in these endeavors, and sometimes creating barriers. Filling this gap is going to be the greatest need for technology transfers in universities. My last thoughts are recommendations regarding the draft of this proposal. I've read the draft and fully support the award criteria. As it relates to proposed funding mechanism, I think it is really important to establish hands-on oversight committees or boards to monitor the accountability of the funded institutions. An excellent model for this is the Wallace H. Coulter Foundation and how they monitored initial investments in translational research at U.S. academic institutions. These investments ultimately led to larger endowments for the research institution, but also spun out many companies at the University of Virginia, including Moshe. With that, I thank you for your time on this very important matter.
Thank you. I now recognize Dr. Hartwell for 5 minutes to present her testimony.
Thank you. I wish to thank the committee, Chairman Bouchon, Ranking Member Lipinski, and the entire subcommittee for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. It is an honor to be provided this opportunity to discuss the draft legislation. As mentioned, I'm Elizabeth Hartwell, and I'm the Assistant Vice President for Research at Purdue University and Associate Director of the Burton D. Morgan Center for Entrepreneurship. Further, in my spare time, I lead a team of dedicated Hoosiers to manage the Office of Technology Commercialization that's housed within the Purdue Research Foundation. Data to quantify the scope of our operation is submitted in the written testimony, so I won't comment on that in my oral. Founded in 1869, West Lafayette, Indiana, Purdue University serves the people of the state of Indiana, the nation, and the world through education, research, and engagement. Purdue educates over 75,000 students statewide each year and is home to a very robust research enterprise of over $650 million in research expenditures, primarily originating from the U.S. taxpayers through such programs as the SBIR and STTR. The committee is both aware and respectful of the critical role the American research enterprise plays in our nation's competitiveness. Universities engage in fundamental research to grow our knowledge base, to advance understanding, and to encourage thinking without constraint or restraint in our next generations. Inherent to exploration in uncharted areas of inquiry, however, is discovery. Discovery can and should lead to delivery. However, gaps in the path that connects discovery to delivery do exist. And in my reading of the current draft of legislation, it is the filling of this gap that is the subject of the proposed draft. Specifically, the committee requested comment on innovative practices employed by Purdue University to develop federally funded research projects. The Purdue Trask Innovation Fund and the Emerging Innovations Funds are two of such programs. While there are details in the written testimony, and I look forward to discussing those relevant aspects of the programs as the committee wishes, I will highlight one output data of those proof of concept fund that we call the Trask Innovation Fund. First, I will say at the outset, this fund is entirely funded with private dollars and not taxpayer dollars. Purdue in 1973 identified this need of a gap between research results and commercial exploitation of those results and set out to fill that gap themselves. And as a result, In the last 5 years, 48 Purdue technologies have been competitively awarded development funding, and of those, 35% of those technologies were sponsored by the U.S. taxpayers. Over the roughly 35-year history of the Trask Venture Fund's support of filling the gap, federally funded Purdue technologies that were supplemented with these awards experienced about a 40% increased licensing rate than those federally funded Purdue technologies that were not supplemented with those awards. In addition, and with brevity, I would like to highlight a few other innovative practices that Purdue University has undertaken in the last several months. The Office of Technology Commercialization has unveiled new procedures and policy implementations to accelerate technology transfer out of the university, whether Purdue University owns the technology or not. Students who create inventions in the performance of their coursework, such as a design project in an engineering course, own their inventions. Purdue inventors who have contributed Purdue-owned intellectual property may elect an as-is license contract to establish a new venture based on those inventions to which she or he contributed. Of particular pertinence to this authorizing body, Purdue now offers recipients of SBIR and STTR grants aimed at developing a Purdue technology a cash-free first option to license the Purdue technology. This express first option allows these recipients to competitively leverage Purdue technology, provides a mechanism to support the commercialization of taxpayer-funded technologies, and supports speed and transparency of the licensing of the same. Accordingly, it should be no surprise that Purdue University strongly supports and encourages the committee's sincere consideration of the draft legislation. It would strengthen and promote partnerships between universities and small businesses to achieve the STTR's stated goals. The proposed legislation superimposes on its predecessor, and it emphasizes the benefits to the nation of technology innovation and the proficiency of small businesses to translate federally funded research results into new products and services. The proposed legislation offers synergy to these relationships between universities and small businesses towards translation and commercialization. So maybe 1 + 1 can indeed equal 3. I'm going to defer the rest of my comments until the Q&A, and in close, I just wish to express my grateful thanks to the committee for the opportunity to participate today and for your leadership, commitment, and partnership on this important topic of technology transfer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now recognize Dr. Liam for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Lipinski, and members of this subcommittee, the University of California, San Francisco is widely recognized as a leader in the health sciences and as the birthplace of biotechnology. I'm here today to testify on my own behalf and would like to thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss the important issue of commercializing federally funded research. I'm a molecular biologist by training and as a prior co-founder of a venture-backed software company, an entrepreneur. At UCSF, I lead a team responsible for streamlining the creation of public-private research partnerships, licensing technologies for commercialization, and education of budding life science entrepreneurs. Federal funding, the lifeblood of basic research, is essential for the development of groundbreaking discoveries. The challenge is commercializing these discoveries for public benefit, especially in capital-intensive fields such as the life sciences. My testimony today on expanding the use of STTR funds to support innovative approaches to increase the commercialization of federally funded research is focused on 3 points specifically related to life science discoveries. First, venture capital, one of the historic mainstays for advancing life science discoveries through proof of concept, has fallen sharply as investors have shifted capital to lower risk opportunities. Early-stage life science ventures are struggling to fund proof of concept, which is a critical value inflection point required to attract investment today. Some estimates suggest that the number of venture firms investing in life sciences has fallen as much as 2/3 in the last 5 years. In essence, a shortage of early-stage, pre-proof of concept funding is impeding the commercialization of federally funded research. My second point, it is reasonable and appropriate for the federal government to play a role in funding proof of concept research at universities research institutes, and national labs, given the requirement today for proof of concept to attract investment. The gap between development of an intriguing yet unproven discovery and the investment to commercialize that discovery is characterized as the valley of death. The virtual disappearance of pre-proof of concept venture financing and the lack of sufficient programs to fund proof of concept research make crossing the valley virtually impossible for countless technologies. Take, for example, a team of investigators from UCSF, the Cleveland Clinic, Vanderbilt University, and the University of Michigan who invented an implantable artificial kidney device with the potential to improve the health and well-being of individuals suffering from kidney failure and to reduce the estimated $41 billion spent annually in the U.S. on this disease. Despite receiving numerous awards based on promising results, having substantial interest from potential corporate partners, and being selected by the FDA as one of 3 projects for a pilot program to fast-track the development of breakthrough medical devices, investors have been reluctant to provide funding without proof of concept in large animals. Simply stated, a new model to attract private investment to once again fuel the commercialization of early-stage discoveries is required. The federal government could play a role in this model. It could help bridge the gap. Finally, I'd like to enthusiastically express support for the draft legislation to expand the use of STTR funds to support innovative approaches that increase the commercialization of federally funded research. Grant programs created under the Act could address the crucial need for proof of concept funding, as well as the need for experiential training in commercialization. For example, I'd welcome expansion of the NSF Innovation Corps program to additional agencies, and the inclusion of phased proof-of-concept funding programs administered by universities, research institutes, and national labs to validate and advance a broader array of federally funded discoveries. I support including requirements for the collection and analysis of programmatic data to identify best practices. Those steps should be taken to ensure that such requirements are not an impediment to participation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Lipinski, and members of this subcommittee for the opportunity to discuss this important issue. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Because of the delayed start, Chairman Smith will not be able to attend, but he asks now that with unanimous consent to submit his statement for the record without objection. I'd like to thank the witnesses for their testimony and remind members of the committee the questioning is limited to 5 minutes. The chair will now recognize himself for 5 minutes for the first round of questioning. Dr. Hartwell, thanks for coming from Purdue. We appreciate that.
My pleasure.
In your testimony, you state that federally funded Purdue technologies that were supplemented by proof of concept awards had about a 40% increase in licensing rate compared with other federally funded programs not supplemented by proof of concept awards. Can you explain what the reasons are for that, and how might the proposed grant program we are considering improve that?
Certainly. Thank you for the question. Yes, that data is 35 to 40 years of data that, granted, this Trask Venture Fund has evolved over time. Very recently, in the last 3 to 4 years, the program is run very similar to a early proof of concept and proof of concept type fund with business executives and local business community representatives, as well as university leadership and advisory council. The funding is targeted through their advisement towards answering questions that de-risk a technology for transfer to a private sector partner. So the goal of the fund has been focused on experiments that fill the gap, and that was part of the fund when it was established in '73. many moons ago, before even the Bayh-Dole legislation that created technology transfer offices in universities. And I believe, based on our experience and having done the analytics of the program over the years, that the targeted deployment with a goal to transfer research results for commercial products and services made the focus of the decision making in such a way that it produced the kinds of outputs that it did, which is the university to transfer out the technology, get it into the hands of a partner like Dr. Wamath Himoshir, whether you're creating a new company or you're partnering through licensing, but to get it out of the university so that it has an opportunity to be developed further into a product and service that can benefit those folks that paid for it. And that is the number that we can use and put our finger on in a reliable way to say that we were able to get going in that right direction. So I believe it's the targeted, the metrics and what you're measuring will determine how these programs perform. And I believe that was part of this program from the beginning and helped inform its outcomes.
Thank you. Dr. Wamhoff, I'm going to ask you, what do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of the STTR program?
I think one of the strengths is that it gives investigators critical seed money to do proof of concept studies, check off a GoNoGo box for a technology that you're trying to commercialize. I think one of the challenges is putting a mechanism in place to let them know what is the GoNoGo box on that technology. Scientists, no one loves their science more than the scientist that's developing it. And there's a lot of emotional attachment to it. And there comes a point for every technology when it's going to move out of academia, does it really have legs? And getting exposure to non-scientists, people from the industry, advisors that can help you make that decision to fail fast and move on is really important and a critical gap that needs to be filled.
Thank you very much. That's all I have. I'll yield now to Ranking Member Mr. Lipinski for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank everyone for their testimony. As I noted in my opening statement, the draft legislation doesn't specify the types of activity that should be supported, so I wanted to get a little bit more into that. Certainly, we heard from, I think, all of you about proof of concept, importance there, and as I said, something I had supported for NIH. It was just NIH because that was the opportunity we had. I certainly think that is critical. Entrepreneurial education, something I also am very supportive of. Dr. Liam mentioned I-Corps, which I have mentioned countless times in this committee. My support for I-Corps, I think that as an entrepreneurial education program that has worked very well and should be expanded to other agencies. What other areas, are there other areas, maybe this is what we should be limiting this bill to, but are there other areas that you think may fit into this bill to help us accelerate the commercialization of federally funded research? Start with Dr. Liam. And if there's nothing else, you don't have to make up something else just to answer the question. I just wanted to see if there were other things you wanted to add.
My impression is that the bill provides significant flexibility on what programs can be developed by agencies. We've already touched on a number of issues that are relevant, from experiential entrepreneur education, mentorship, resources within the university to provide a strong infrastructure for technology transfer. I think all of those issues are very important. Again, based on the draft legislation, it appears to me that those types of programs could be developed.
Dr. Hartwell?
Yes, I would like to add the critical component and coincident with technology development is cultivation of business experiential learning, kind of on the job. There is student entrepreneurship programs, I think, at a lot of universities, including Purdue, but perhaps these are opportunities that the faculty researcher or staff or students who are participating in the development of the technology would also perhaps benefit from business support services. I would agree that my reading of the draft allows that degree of freedom, and I refer to a creative license, the way that I read the draft, so that it can be customized to the appropriate geographic regions and what those needs are. But I would add that one of the support mechanisms that could accelerate the translation and transfer of federally funded research results is business support services, or mentoring and counseling along those lines, just generally, of how to write a business plan. These are things that are not taught to you in graduate school, as you well know, when you get a STEM advanced degree. Thank you.
I remember when I wrote my first business plan, actually. I had no idea what I was doing. I was 6 years into tenure. But I agree with you, Dr. Hartwell, that bringing the private sector into this in any way possible, I think, is a great idea. At the end of the day, they are the consumer of this technology before it goes into the general public. They're the ones licensing it out of the university. They're the ones that are further developing it, putting more capital into it to make it available to the taxpayer. And I don't think there's enough of that. I know at Purdue you've recently changed your boards around where you have a lot of influence, advisors from the private sector. It's not just an academic setting. And having that leeway to do that, I think, would be really important.
Thank you. I quickly ask Dr. Liam, you talked about UCSF's entrepreneurial education activities. You're certainly strong in the focus on life sciences. Are there any steps that you are taking to adapt entrepreneurial education courses like I-Core to life sciences? Are there any other special hurdles that you face in facilitating tech transfer from the life sciences that other disciplines do not face?
Sure. I think I'll start with the hurdles of transferring life science technologies into the commercial sector first. Life science technologies have a particularly long time frame for development. They're very high risk in general. There's technical risk, regulatory risk, as in will the product be approved by the FDA, reimbursement risk. So and then the comments that I made regarding proof of concept funding. So there's significant risk related to the investment in the life sciences that are not present in all other fields. In regard to the Innovation Core, the UCSF is fortunate in participating in the program. The University of California, Berkeley, UCSF, and Stanford form the Bay Area Innovation Core node. UCSF in particular is developing life science specific curriculum for the Innovation Core program in the fields of drugs, devices, diagnostics, and digital health. And I'd be happy to answer any questions about that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Collins for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank both you and Chairman Smith for assisting me and us in putting this forth. My background, yes, I am a mechanical engineer from North Carolina State, even though I know you have a background from Duke. We won't talk about Duke. There you go. But I also have a biotechnology company with 2 level 3+ spacesuit labs involved, virus production and the like, and also a phase 2B multiple sclerosis secondary progressive MS drug trial ongoing right now in Australia and New Zealand. So I live the life sciences world a lot, at least before I came here. But I agree with you on the Valley of Death and the scientists who do really love their science. But when you talk to them and say, all right, now how are we going to get it to market? What is the market? How are we going to price it? And again, what's the fail-safe point? They usually give you the deer in the headlights look. But one question I know we're going to get is we're going to take money that's already in the STTR program and say we want to designate a small piece of it for this new Valley of Death proof of concept. Would you speak to what you would say the return on investment to the taxpayers in taking this small piece and addressing the Valley of Death versus not doing that and having that money instead go to the traditional programs? In other words, speak to the importance of creating this and what I would hope would be a very high return on investment, or your opinion on that for the taxpayers. We'll start with Dr. Walmoff.
Sure. I don't know the metrics on the success of the STTR mechanism, but I can tell you that anytime you can decrease the gap in the valley of death, it's a good return on any investment. Whether it's advice or seed funding on a go, no-go decision, you can end a $2 million venture with $100,000 of seed funding very quickly and say, you know what, this is great science, but it's not going to translate out. Take it back into the lab and do what you need to do, publish in your academic career. So I'm fully for it. I think that it's a real event that happens to a lot of academic investigators. They just get lost.
Good. Thank you. Dr. Hartwell?
Yes, thank you. I think metrics in this space are always tough. This is difficult. There's a lot of good momentum in discussing and deliberating what are appropriate metrics. I will note in my written testimony that Purdue, we also have a pre-seed evergreen fund for new ventures. Most of the applicants to these programs, as well as the proof of concept, are in the life sciences. There is some data following gap funds in universities, and the biggest consumer of these funds is in the life sciences, and that's not surprising given the high risk associated with those technologies. My belief is, and live this every day, is that if universities can incubate a little longer some of these technologies and de-risk them, there are opportunities that are that will be delivered to the private sector, in particular small businesses. It is our preference. They are statistically proven to generate more jobs. We are responsible to helping those technologies along as much as we can, and a lot of universities are doing that at their own expense. And it is only the federal government that can step in and have broad impact across the board. And I see that embraced in the spirit of this legislation. So I actually see synergy and improvements in the starting point from which a small business would pick a technology up. Perhaps what Dr. Womack articulated wouldn't have to be the norm anymore.
Thank you. We're running a little out of time, so not to skip Dr. Liam, but I'd like to ask each of you, right now there's a $150,000 limit on the Phase 1 STTR funding. We haven't addressed a particular number here, and I wonder if you could offer a quick opinion on what you might think would be an appropriate dollar limit for this Valley of Death funding.
Oh, for the Valley of Death funding? So you're talking about pre-STTR money, essentially.
Yeah, you've got the $150,000 Phase 1, the $1 million Phase 2.
I can tell you that with the Coulter Foundation at the University of Virginia, you could do a lot with $25,000 to $50,000. I believe you have a specific number.
Our data suggests an average of $48,000.
So $50,000 would be a good number for both of you. Dr. Liam?
We have a small program at the University of California, San Francisco that averages between $50,000 and $75,000. One comment that I would also make is that I believe that the award size should reflect the technology and the market and the next milestone or inflection point of value that one wants to achieve.
Good. Thank you all for your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Esty for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I want to thank Mr. Collins for asking several of my questions. But to follow up on that and really to sort of point out the question you asked about diversion of funds from other existing programs, I believe, Dr. Liam, you mentioned how the current structure, presumably because it does not fund the Valley of Death, ends up then with premature formation of startups which then fail. So could you discuss a little bit whether you think this focus on permitting grants to be used, and relatively, we're talking small amounts of grants, $50,000, $75,000. Can you explain if you think that really would help better deployment and leverage of those resources?
The simple answer to the question is yes. I believe that that conducting proof of concept research within the university where the discovery was made can be done much less expensively than in the context of a company. Creating a company and the cost of a company and the complications of a company and the distraction that the company represents for a faculty member relative to being able to raise a small amount of proof of concept funding do the research within the university using the same individuals that likely made the invention is actually would be a significant advantage, and ultimately in the long run would be a better utilization of capital.
I represent Northwest Connecticut, so we have Farmington Yukon Medical Center with the Jackson Labs coming in, and synergies with Yale as well, and attempting to do this licensing better. Can any of you discuss, this is a great concern in my state, things that we might be able to do as we look at this issue about aiding universities that are already very focused on this? What can we do to aid that process on the tech transfer? We've got big centers, both of them working a lot of life sciences. Are there other things we haven't flagged in this bill or related issues that we should put on our radar?
I think many of the comments that have been made today related to having external boards and mentorship are very important in the context of actually licensing as well. We recently were negotiating a license with a small company and reached out to neutral parties in the field, neutral venture capitalists, to determine what the cost or what the value of the technology was, to provide us some comfort in the level of in the financial terms that we were negotiating. We were actually, by doing that kind of homework, able to complete the financial negotiations within 1 hour. So I think that engaging the commercial community to help in the technology transfer process is essential.
And a final quick question. There's been some discussion, certainly we've looked at at Commerce looking at regional clustering for, say, excellence in manufacturing. Is this something we could also be looking at, say, in the life sciences? Again, that's an area where they're looking at public-private partnerships to address in part these entrepreneurial outside advice to help make that transition. We've been attempting to do this with angel investing at the state level in Connecticut, but obviously the resources get quite limited, and there's criticism that we're picking winners and losers. So can you help us, how do we avoid that picking of winners and losers problem, but nevertheless provide the resources for these startups? The outside advice, do you have thoughts on how we could structure that, what the federal government's role should be, or whether that's just advisory to suggest that they do this?
I think advice has to be tailored very specifically to the technology that one is examining at any particular time. We have a program within the Clinical Translational Science Institute at the University of California, San Francisco, that utilizes mentors with very specific expertise to advise faculty with early stage technologies. So I'm very supportive of these structures. That program is structured in such a way where there is a call for proposals twice a year from faculty. They're evaluated by boards of mentors. Individuals are selected and mentored for a period of months, and then there's a report out at the culmination. And a number of the projects then receive a small amount of funding. I think there's an opportunity to use those types of external boards to help make these types of decisions.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. I now recognize Dr. Berra, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm not a mechanical engineer, but a physician, and I will give a shout out to the University of California system where I did my training and was on faculty. I think this is fascinating, and again, I'm glad that we're addressing the issue of technology transfer. When you talk about this valley of death, going through this 3 stages from basic research to proof of concept to commercialization, I know when we're in the lab, and in the academic center, we just like to think of ideas, and we like to, and the academic center is very well situated for this exchange of ideas, which is what we're trying to do. But we're not thinking about how to take product to market. And it's always occurred to me that if we could take the entrepreneur and actually partner them very early on. So while we're formulating our ideas and so forth, they're also thinking about and providing input into how to bring that product to market. So again, creating a context that allows that to happen at an early stage as opposed to a later stage certainly is something that we should be working on. And I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on how we best go about getting that at the earlier stage. The other question is, I was down at the University of California, San Diego this past weekend meeting with Chancellor Kozla and some of his faculty, and I knew this hearing was coming up, so I actually posed to them the question of what could we do to better help technology transfer, obviously at one of our major research institutions, and the answer they gave me surprised me. What he said was, look at tax-exempt bonds. And I tested this with my home institution at UC Davis, and they talked about how the Federal Tax Reform Act really limits their ability to provide research space that said, industry is knocking on their door. They want to partner. They want to come in and work side by side in these lab spaces. But our tax code currently limits their ability, because these are tax-exempt bonds, to allow the entrepreneur to come in. And I would ask you guys to comment on that and provide perspective. So, Dr. Hartwell.
I'll take that first. While I'm not a tax attorney or a mechanical engineer, for that matter, we run into this and we have this conversation, and actually more vigorous conversations more recently. What you're referring to is what's referred to as private use and bonded facilities. Exactly. And there is a prohibition on basically for-profit activities in those spaces. So that is actually an input in the analysis that's often not considered inside the university in the dialogue on the outside, but is a critical go, no-go of whether a university can even undertake a partnership, whether it wishes to or not. It would be a very, I think, appropriate in the context of all of the conversations about realizing the value of federally funded research through products and services where appropriate, to consider and take up the question of private use and its impact, positive and negative, on this whole ecosystem.
So it would be possible, actually, in this body to perhaps amend the Tax Reform Act to allow, at an earlier stage, those entrepreneurs to come in to the lab, work side by side. Dr. Liam, yep.
Yes, I think that would be true. We do have relationships with corporations that allow for their personnel to come onto campus and work closely with our investigators, but on a limited basis. One example of a close relationship that the University of California, San Francisco has is the Center for Therapeutic Innovation with Pfizer. In this particular case, they've established a laboratory across the street from the campus. We do believe very strongly that collaborative research between industry and academics is essential to translating academic inventions into the commercial sector. I can also take, if you'd like, I can also comment on your first question related to, in essence, if I understood you correctly, early intervention. I think a very good model for this, again, is the National Science Foundation Innovation Corps program. This is a program that takes small teams at the very earliest stages that apply to participate. It's highly experiential. The teams go through a process of meeting with a very large number of customers and stakeholders from whatever particular market is appropriate for the technology that they have over a relatively short period of time to establish beyond proof of concept around the technology itself, but actually that they understand what the market is, what the product should be, what they would be able to charge for it. So really getting a much, much deeper understanding. That's a short, intensive program. The goal is to help to help individuals or to help teams fail early, and then also to identify those that have a successful concept and take those forward.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Kilmer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for your testimony. You've shared with us, I think, some interesting ideas around a number of themes: financing, mentorship, partnerships. We talked about some challenges, including prohibitions on for-profit activities, and that's something we've grappled with in my state, the state of Washington, where we had to update our ethics laws as we dealt with commercialization of research. Can you touch on, as you look both in the areas where you work and other states, have you seen any other best practices that as we noodle on these issues, we ought to be thinking about, we ought to be looking at, and that we ought to think about scaling up at the federal level?
I will comment that I believe there are a number of practices undertaken across the country now as you start to see folks inside the university change over into individuals with industrial experience or experience in technology transfer. For example, Dr. Wamoff, the Coulter, I will say the Wallace H. Coulter Foundation, in my opinion, is a best practice that is scalable and is embedded in a number of universities throughout the country, a small number, and is not dissimilar to how we implement our proof of concept awards. But the business advisement component that's been mentioned as critical is a requirement, I believe. A business advisor who is compensed for their time and know-how and expertise, and then done so in a way that conflicts of interest and tax bonds, all these types of very critical considerations are done with the goal in mind, which is not dissimilar to your proposed legislation. So I would offer up that program as a best practice.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Libby said. The Coulter Foundation, that mechanism is extremely effective. What they were able to do with a $1 million seed grant at the University of Virginia and parsing out $25,000, $50,000, $75,000 seed grants, and the number of companies that launched off of that simply because of the fact there was an oversight board of university faculty, but more importantly, outside members in the community as well as other industries helping academics make very critical go, no-go decisions. It's either going to work when you do this study or it's not going to work. And at the end of the day, you're going to know whether to turn left, right, or keep going forward or abandon it. And that is a mechanism that's now, I think, being implemented not just in the original 9 universities, but they've now branched it out probably closer to 20 universities. So it's in place, and it's a great structure.
I think that we've touched on a number of themes today that are repeated in many programs across the nation, from proof of concept funding, fail early, experiential learning for entrepreneurship, bringing mentors, actually true commercial mentorship to the table. One thing that hasn't been mentioned is incubator space. I think it's important to have space that this type of work can be done in, particularly when it is time to create a company. Have space that a small company can take a very small amount of space and move forward. Really, it's about creating the ecosystem. And so if we can create an ecosystem that supports entrepreneurship and commercialization within the academic environment without actually fundamentally changing the academic mission of an institution, I think we would be very successful. The educational issues that we face are significant. I think we've all mentioned or referred to them in terms of individuals understanding truly what does it take to take a basic discovery into the commercial marketplace. It's a very complex process. The mentorship alone can be very time consuming. But again, these are the kind of themes, and ultimately what the goal is to create that entrepreneurial, supportive environment that cultivates this.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to thank the witnesses for their valuable and very fascinating testimony, and for the members for their questions. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. The witnesses are excused and the hearing is adjourned.